Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am again joined by Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy and Swithun Dobson, and we're here to talk about what were the means by which the progressive ideology became dominant. Not the question is what are the pre-existing philosophical underpinnings of it, but what are the mechanical, the means by which it became the dominant gestalt of our age. So, Swithin, why don't you sort of frame this for us here?
So the standard conservative narrative conservative ink, I suppose, is that everything is kind of nice and dandy in the 50s, and in the 60s everything goes wrong. You have all the bad ideology promulgated in universities, and that's when the schools start going downhill, and lots of focus will be on schools as a means of spreading sort of progressive ideas, and also the media as well. More articulate ones will go, yeah, actually the media is quite film, TV, the arts, etc. is highly influential. So that kind of, I think that makes sense to some extent. Although schools, I think, as a major drive is probably quite a lot later, but that's not the point here, at least at the moment. The question arises, why were they in a position to do this in the 1960s? Because standard conservative narrative is, well, before the 60s, things were fine. So how did people who were so sort of influential in ideas, which would then influence the 60s onward society that we currently inhabit? So, I mean, schools you can't really point to particularly as a major force, at least not for most people, because school attendance is relatively low before, say, the Second World War. So you can't use a standard school narrative, although I suppose you could to some extent. But again, I mean, if you look at what they were teaching back then, at least at the primary or sort of secondary or high school, well, high school was not as old then, but I mean, stuff that, I mean, you think it's pretty sort of solid and sort of relatively non-progressive in certain respects. So the question is, how does the ideas, how are they transferred? So you could argue potentially universities to some extent, and they became powerful socially to sort of use these ideas. But what is really the genesis of how these things get around? I mean, even sort of like the universities in certain respects, because I mean, you don't have mass schooling, at least beforehand. You don't have the mass media in the same way. I mean, you have the printing press, but not that many people read that much. Maybe in the middle and the upper middle classes, to some extent. But I mean, probably one of the biggest cultural institutions was possibly the church. People will get the ideas of what was true and good and right, etc. via the church. This is in the West, of course. And so you could potentially make the sort of some of the dissident right narrative, maybe that Christianity spawns the you could make the argument that Christianity is a progressive religion in a sense, and not an argument I would necessarily buy per se, but you could, that's a potential mechanism by which these sort of ideas, at least in sort of utero, are disseminated. I mean, that's a potential mechanism. You could potentially also say maybe the urbanization of the 19th century. Possibly you got people together away from the traditional settings of society of agrarianism, which then made, and you have much more of an artificial society, not artificial in the sense of it necessarily bad, but rather it's much more human dominated, and you can sort of change reality to your will. And so for things we don't like about reality, we can potentially change. That's maybe not a mechanism as such, but at least gave fertile ground for why it was sort of taken on, and at least a place for it to happen. So this is, I mean, some very sketchy thoughts, but it would seem to me that the major drivers of change, the conservative narrative goes to the media and the schools are really not sufficient to explain why such ideas are largely hegemonic in the upper classes in the post-war period, because they simply hadn't existed to a sufficient extent at that point.
Right.
So that's my overall setup. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on this.
Well, there are, I think, a lot of independent vectors that feed into the creation of these ideologies. But I think where I would start, and this exists, prior, during the quote unquote good old days of the 50s, there are like two, well, actually it's really one interest, but there are two interests that are at work, I don't know, by as early as like 1912, trying to get us here. One is the foundations, so the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, all these foundations, which are essentially funds for vested corporate interests, have been trying to shape American perspectives over the decades. And the way they usually do it is they try to corner the market, so to speak, in a field of experts. It's like, let's say they want to have control over. I think I don't know if this conspiracy is real or not, but I've heard there was a conspiracy that one of the reasons why oil became the dominant fuel in America rather than other alternatives, which were being considered in like the 1912-ish area, was because of these, corporate guys. They were the ones that were hiring and training all of these quote unquote, engineering science experts. And then when they got jobs at other institutions, they were all going from the Carnegie and Ford playbook. They also did this with history after World War II. The American Historical Association was used by was Carnegie's to rewrite history to make sure that revisionism could never happen again. Revisionism at the expense of the U.S. government. And so these interests are subtly working behind the scenes to shape and nudge American opinion. And they're backed by the most wealthy people in the country. And then the corporate interests themselves. So, for example, when you look at desegregation in the South and across the country, I mean, you could argue, where is this coming from if we're coming from a more socially conservative era before? Well, I think the one institution that was large enough and powerful enough to want to do this were corporations, because, if you have racial segregation, you can't treat people as fungible units, but you need to treat people as fungible units because that's how their business model works. And of course, furthermore, if you treat people as fungible units and mix them all up, they're not going to organize unions. So I think that's really the main reason, a huge driving factor. Now, of course, the corporations aren't going to act directly. They're going to act behind the foundations, but they're really one and the same. So I think that's one element, and maybe even the most important element that explains the means by which they took over. But if you look at, again, Hollywood, even, and the radio, even before, television and stuff like that, themes that were generally progressive were very early on being pushed in Hollywood and glamorized and, made to look trendy and made to look, like it could work in real life, even though it never does. And, people had been growing up on that for a very long time. People had, 30 years, from say, the when Hollywood really started to get big with, color and voice acting. And that shapes a lot of public opinion in a very sort of direct way. I sort of like view Hollywood or these sort of like screenwriters is kind of like, wizards that cast spells on people with what they're saying in there, which is actually a position that Alan Moore takes, the author of The Watchmen and a lot of those graphic novels. So it's not something that I'm just coming up with. And I think that's also a factor. And also, I think we see the underlying factor that all was not well in the 50s. Because in part, the family was already under a lot of strain. It just didn't look like it, right? Because all these kids grew up with their silent gen parents and then freaked out, and that was called the 60s. So what explains this huge freak out? I think part of it is there was a lot of dysfunction and trauma that was the result of World War II. Given such a large proportion of the male population was drafted and sent to war, they came back psychologically damaged, and they really weren't able to have the same kind of relationships that they would have had before. And so, it's easy to imagine children growing up in that context, seeing that, all is not well from the inside. And also you can look at the fact that this is also coinciding with after World War II, coinciding with the rise of like career culture. And, one of the problems with career culture is that the husband is just always away working and never at home. That was one of the complaints of the housewives in suburbia. Is like, husband's never home. I'm alone all day long. And then if they had kids, they'd be alone all day long. Before and after school, that is. So the fragmentation of the family was already happening. It just on the outside it looked good, but as we saw with the explosion in the 60s, it wasn't so good. It just looked good on the outside. And so those are just some ideas I'm spitballing. How about you, Keith? Your answer to Swithun's proposition?
Well, I would probably turn the clock back a little bit further. I'd probably go back to the early 19th century, because we have to first of all clarify what we mean by progressivism. What gets defined as progressive changes from generation to generation. But the way I would define progressivism is the idea that you can, through the power of the state and through other institutions, you can micromanage society in a way that involves social engineering efforts to produce whatever kind of results you're trying to achieve at the time. The goals may change over time, but the methodology stays the same. And I think this can be traced back to the early 19th century. First, you have the Enlightenment, and out of the Enlightenment comes this idea of rationality and rationalism, and the idea of progress, the idea that, well, if human beings just apply scientific principles to everything and use sound reasoning, that it's possible to endlessly perfect the human species, human perfectibility, and all of that. And then you also see during the same time the growth of technology, and you see with industrialization, you see societies becoming more complex, and you see that there's a wider degree of specialization, and then out of that comes the public administration state, the idea of the state that is organized in a way that rationally plans society or manages society according to some kind of model of efficiency. And then out of that, you get the idea of bureaucracy as we understand it. The way that it developed probably began with Germany and spread throughout the developed world. Bureaucracy in the same sense that Max Weber critiqued it. So this is really the sort of the historical or institutional framework in which progressivism emerges. It's sort of a mixture of an increasingly complex technological society, the Industrial Revolution, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, and then this idea of the public administration state. So all of those things kind of converge, and that's what creates progressivism in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it's interesting to see how progressivism changes. If we go back and look at what an early 20th century progressive believed and what a person who's a self-identified progressive believes today, and on one hand they're very similar in the sense that it's typically it's about social reform and use of the state for purposes of social reform. There's an emphasis on environmentalism and things like that. There's an emphasis on the welfare state. But in the early 20th century, progressives were also interested in eugenics. Racism was actually considered progressive at the time by a lot of progressives. Also, they tended to have a more I guess, Victorian or maybe Augustinian view of sexual morals and things like that. And it's interesting that modern progressives have, on one hand, retained some elements of the older models of progressivism, but then they've discarded or even inverted other aspects of early progressivism. But as to how progressivism becomes hegemonic, I think it has to do with the growth of mass society, the fact that we have a lot more people. Society becomes more complex. Along with that comes the growth of institutions that are set up to manage all kinds of social functions, which has the effect of expanding the public administration state that I was talking about earlier. In industrial organizations and economic organizations and financial organizations become a lot larger. They become a lot more sophisticated. We have the growth of much larger institutions generally in terms of number of people involved and level of complexity in terms of being divided into bureaus and layers and things like that. We also see the rise of increasingly higher levels of literacy. Education becomes more pervasive. More people are literate, more people at least go to high school. Also, the rise of the mass media, I think, plays a role in this. Media was made possible by technology. I mean, before there could be radio, there had to be transistors. Before there could be television, there had to be the ability to send television signals. So, with the rise of the media comes a method of disseminating propaganda that no society or no ruling class had ever had previously. Also, we have to understand the growth of the sciences, the social sciences, the managerial sciences. If you study the history of management theory, you can see how management theorists have always tried to come up with ways of making workforces work more efficiently and things like that. Taylorism and Fordism and all of that stuff that comes out of the early 20th century. There's also the growth of the public relations industry. If you go back and you look at the career of a guy like Edward Bernays and how modern systems of propaganda were created, and this, of course, converges with technology and with the growth of the media. And as Todd was talking about, the growth of the entertainment industry, which serves as sort of a conduit for dissemination of propaganda. So all of these things can really develop parallel to each other and at the same time, and they converge. And out of that is how you start to get I guess you could call it progressive hegemony. Although I do think we have to first define what progressivism is. A lot of people, I think particularly Americans, get confused about what is progressivism as opposed to liberalism, as opposed to socialism, as opposed to populism. There's this idea that some people have, for example, that anything government does is progressivism or socialism or something like that, or any kind of left-sounding policy proposals of progressivism. I'd have a narrower definition of progressivism, in that progressivism is about social engineering. It's about micromanaging society towards particular ends. To use a few examples, like if you look at different policies, like right now, you've got people who say they want Medicare for all. Whether that's a good idea or not, I wouldn't necessarily say that's a progressive idea as much as a social democratic one, more of a welfare statist idea. Or if you have somebody who is big on equal opportunity, where we've got to find a way to, get more job skills to poor inner city kids or whatever, so they can get a better job. That's definitely reform liberalism, but I don't know that that's progressivism. But then when you have someone like, say, Michael Bloomberg, who wanted to have all sorts of special taxes on foods and beverages and everything to encourage physical fitness and weight loss, now that's progressivism, this idea of micromanaging everything towards these kinds of social engineering purposes. But you do see this idea becoming more entrenched in institutions about a century ago, even if the form that it's taken has changed over time. And then some of the themes have remained the same as well. And I think it's due to this convergence of ideas and institutions and social trends and technological and economic trends that happened at the same time.
All right, terminal philosophy. Your take on all this?
Right. Well, it's an interesting question. There's a lot of ways to analyze this. I think to Keith's general historical point, I tend to agree with the general view that events like the French and American revolutions, eras like the Industrial Revolution, are events that reflect the desire of the common person to not be under the boot of of a total state or of a highly controlling monarchy or something like that. It seems to be that people generally prefer to be more free and part of something bigger than themselves, like a citizen of a nation, rather than the subject of a king or a despot or something like that. So I think that's probably an important place to start with why things are currently the way they are now. And going on with that, with the early modern period, there wasn't so much material wealth or availability. But as we got into the later parts of the 19th century, with more industrialization occurring in places like Germany and Great Britain and France and the United States and parts of Japan and very small anecdotal examples in China and a few other places, you start to accrue this material wealth and availability. And through that, I think that once you have a surplus of material wealth, people start to have more free time. And this is just something that probably wasn't nearly as common in eras like the Middle Ages, where there might have been free time, but what options do you have for your free time? Well, that's highly limited compared to people of the early modern period. So I think what you have is this gradual material wealth being built up, and then there is a term that you occasionally hear in academia and in the I think somewhere in the preface or the introduction of it's either Stanley Payne's A History of Fascism or Paul Gottfried's fascist book. There's this term that you sometimes hear in social sciences called lifestyle liberation. And I think that's just a general sort of umbrella term for a way for people to basically seek out their own lifestyle on a sort of highly individual level, almost like a hyper individualist type of a level. Whereas, in the quote unquote good old days in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, things were much more community oriented. And then after, post 1960s, we're kind of entering this sort of hyper individualistic world. And what made that possible, I think, was a lot of the historical reasons that Keith had mentioned. But I think it's, there's this, I think it's just really a natural extension of Enlightenment philosophy for, just pursuing this path of individuality to its logical conclusion. And I think this is more or less kind of what we are carrying out at the moment. So this desire to, find yourself, as it were, you sometimes hear that from a lot of people. And then I think you have a few other factors like, big business. And as Todd was saying, with the generation of foundations like the Ford Foundation at the beginning of the 20th century, you have this business model being superimposed on society. And that model is really highly predicated on a population that is not at odds with each other over perceived social differences or racial differences or income differences, things like that. And so, this business model needs people to be more similar to each other than different than each other. And then, of course, I think Hollywood is a big, I think that's a huge factor, to be honest. I think movies really change the way people think about life. And, it's true to say that the post-silent film era, when things started going, I mean, for example, the famous Dracula film that starred Bela Lugosi in the late 1930s, I mean, that really stirred a lot of imaginations in terms of how to create horror films. And that created a whole sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was, the horror genre was a big that was a big contribution to the golden age of film. I don't know the exact dates on the golden age of film, but that really changes the way that people perceive living in general. Whereas, I mean, if you had taken a person from back in time, from the 1300s in rural England, and you had them watch, anything, Lord of the Rings, Saving Private Ryan, Apocalypse Now, I mean, it would be flabbergasting to be overwhelmed with something like that. So, and then I think the last thing I'll say here is this. Todd already kind of touched on it, but I think it's worth mentioning again, is this sort of this culture of like workaholism, where in order to maintain this material wealth and availability on a mass societal level, mass society means like a much larger population than previous societies in history, where there are tens of millions of people as opposed to maybe a few million people, or in smaller places like several 100,000. Well, you need a large workforce, and able-bodied men typically make up a workforce. And so you have typically, dads are gone and the suburban life is left at home. And even nowadays you have things like where kids are being raised by their grandparents, and both parents are working just due to the cost of living and various other economic reasons. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of cliche to say this, but there's no one silver bullet answer as to why progressivism is such a sort of the dominant social ideology of the present day. But I think these are probably the most important reasons. I'll leave it at that.
So, Swithun, there's a lot of grist for your mill here. What do you think?
Well, it got me thinking. Primarily, the conduit for any spread of any idea, good, bad, or indifferent, is primarily born of technology. I mean, obviously, back to ancient societies, primarily it would have been, there's relatively low levels of literacy. Well, some people could read and some people write, not that many. I remember, was it Plato Plato via Socrates complains that the memory's going to go because you're starting writing stuff down, you're not doing it orally. But so prior to, say, the printing press in particular, I mean, there are people going to write manuscripts, and people can read, but they're going to be very, very few and far between. So primarily, the way in which any ideas will be disseminated is via people, directly, as in speaking. So that would be sort of like an early, obvious way of doing it. And then it would seem to be the case that from sort of the printing press onwards and the increase in literacy, this then is a way of reaching more people than you would otherwise have reached. And so the scales as to the major form of influence on person or on print probably is going to largely depend on the extent to which you have literacy in society. So earlier on, people who had social standing and status culturally in person would be the ones who would be able to influential in society in general. So that goes back to possibly, say, the churches, at least in the West, generally speaking, probably is the primary driver of ideas into the general population until probably the mid-19th century, the earliest. Although elite class debates and writing and literacy would be a lot higher. Although it'd be interesting, you could probably make the claim that the printing press and writing becomes much more influential in Protestant countries earlier than in Catholic ones, due to the focus on sort of sola scriptura and reading the Bible for yourself, etc. So that would certainly change it. So a focus, in a sense, has to be on largely a technological, either by technology or by the person to deliver the information. But then the question arises, and I think I go towards sort of Keith's explanation to some extent as to why was it the case that these certain progressive ideas were taken up. I do think sort of mass society, as it were, and I think I alluded to it earlier, you do have a breaking down of traditional societal structures. I mean, in England, for example, you have, I mean, they started earlier in the 18th century with moving to the cities and the towns of the Enclosures Act. The extent to which I think you have a forcible or just any breakup, as it were, of your traditional sort of extended family group kind of weakens the bonds that seem to be there by nature. And that's what I was mentioned earlier with sort of agriculture. You think, well, there's something fixed in the world and you have to work with it. The extent to which technology grows means that you can then be bound, can be turned to your will. And then, so we have urbanized, sort of a more urbanized society, especially with a lot of people. This could change the kind of ideas. Although that said, urbanization does take place earlier and progressivism doesn't really exist. So that can't be an entire explanation. Although you could make the case of the extent of technology, because mentioning the city sizes is interesting. I believe one estimate of Rome at its height is a population of about 1 million people. The Roman society wasn't progressive. I mean, that's I think that's an obviously true statement. So technology can't explain all of it. Possibly the breaking down of traditional family ties, etc., with so many people moving at once, possibly, just to some extent. But I think for the mass of people to sort of get ready to accept it, I do possibly think church influence and sort of certain forms of liberal post-millennialism is possibly one of the ways that so the liberal post-millennialists from the pulpit could well have implicitly sort of got those ideas through. So the post-millennialists believe that, you know, we can basically create heaven on earth before Jesus returns by being good people to everybody. And this then allows you to sort of like, well, what we need to do is sort of tinker with society to make it better. It kind of downplays the traditional theological concepts of, say, original sin and things like that. And man's kind of perfectible, and that sort of like fits in with the growth of technology. So I think maybe I'm coming around to the idea maybe the technological advancements and the large urbanization is probably why these ideas come. And then, of course, as Keith mentioned, you get the social problems that creates, and then you get sort of the elite class going, oh, well, we can just sort of move things around, etc., and pull the levers here and there to optimize society. Also related to the 1950s, I think one of the big changes as well, their technology as well, is the big road building program. That's when you get sort of urban development, which is atypical historically. And again, that breaks down extended family relations, and it becomes much more individualized. And so there's much more focus on you as an individual expressing yourself and as your will dictates, rather than being constrained by society or your family group or whatever. And so I think now whether that makes it progressive as such, micromanage at the state level, is another question. But it does link in with sort of like you could say sort of in a sense expressive individualism. Oh, well, what we're doing is we're sort of like creating the conditions where every individual can express his full potential. I mean, it's not a necessary combination, but I think that's related. And back to your point, Todd, on the foundations and the corporations, I do think that is certainly what funded a lot of sort of artistic works and foundations to sort of promulgate these ideas. It reminds me of the Rees report. Is that correct? Yes, the Rees report in the 50s, which highlighted sort of. I think the claim was originally there was sort of spreading communism, but it was they were certainly, you could argue, spreading un-American ideas, as it were, and that was even by far as the 50s. So I'm still not sure exactly what I think, but I think technological growth and urbanization and large-scale urbanization, along with the breaking of traditional societal bonds, I think does create conditions for progressive ideas to be taken on. I think that's what I would say.
Yeah. With regards to technology, I think technology is probably the main driving factor. But I want to be careful how I say this. I don't want to necessarily say that as technology advances, progressivism is a necessary result. So, like, for example, from the point of view of the progressive narrative, National Socialist Germany was an aberration, but it was a technological society that was a reflection of its own time. So I don't want to say that necessarily makes it the case, but what a technological society does do by removing physical, biological realities is it allows you to pretend that they don't exist. So, for example, the fact that we can pretend men and women are equal is only because we have tampons. I mean, have women go off tampons for 6 months, and we'll just see how equal we are. It's technology creates the illusion that we're equal, or we just don't need people at all because machines do it. In which case, the bonds that had to be cultivated to hold society together, which have a broadly more right-leaning bent to it, can be abandoned. You don't have to abandon them necessarily, but they do get abandoned. And so what I'm saying is that minimally technology creates a space where you can pretend to forego, the sort of physical realities out there. So while many on the right, especially the dissonant right, would say that nature has a right-wing bent, and they're absolutely correct. I mean, if you look at hunter-gatherer societies, without any human technology to really speak of, it's nature red in tooth and claw. It's Conan the Barbarian. I mean, that's what these people are. Whereas once you have, when the left says, the history has a progressive arc to it, well, they can only pretend to say that because technology, as it progresses, allows the progressive ideology to progress, because without the technology, these lifestyles, these modes of living would be impossible. And so I think that that's really important. And I also think it's important to see that when it comes to, as for foundations, what people don't understand is that behavior is the result of law. The reason why we have such a, quote, we speak of a deregulated sexual marketplace is precisely because it is deregulated. There are very few rules in place. Well, they're building them back up now. That's with the sort of progressive affirmative consent. But they stripped all the rules down that were inherited from Christianity from the 1960s onward. And then they realized that it was a chaotic free-for-all that only benefited the strong. So then they started writing their own ad hoc rules after the fact. But what drove the shift to the legal framework was Kinsey's Sexuality and the Human Male, which was published in 1948 and funded by the Rockefellers. So what we see is these foundations create a sort of policy study, if you will, that then is used to inform the legislation of the country, which is then used to socially change the values of the country. So the foundations and broader technological advancement, I think, are crucial. Keith Preston, your thoughts?
Well, I think one factor that has fueled progressivism over time is the growth of more affluent societies. I talked a little bit about the impact of the Industrial Revolution and specialization and technology and all of that. And some of you have followed up on that as well. But I do think that one of the impacts of societies that are simply wealthier and more affluent is that it creates a kind of space where these kinds of ideas can find root. For instance, if you look at the progressivism as it is today, which largely has its roots in the 60s culture and the cultural upheavals of the 1960s, you see that one thing that was unique about the 1960s is that that was really the first generation in history to grow up in a post-scarcity society. Even in developed countries prior to that, that is countries that had achieved a significant level of industrialization, there was still a fair amount of scarcity prior to the post-war period, and there still was in some countries, and not just so-called third world countries. I mean, even in some Western countries, there was a lot of fairly extensive poverty during that time. But particularly in the United States, in the post-war period, you had, for the first time in history, a situation where you had a working class that more or less had the lifestyle of an upper middle class by world standards or by historical standards. The idea that you had a family that lived independently of the extended family in a nice house in a subdivision with multiple vehicles, and you could do all this with one adult's income. That would have been unthinkable in previous generations of working class people. So I think one thing that happened was, because of the rising affluence in certain parts of the world, people had more time to start thinking about other things. They started to, and that's when you start to see all of these other movements of that time period starting to develop. You start to see a much greater interest in feminism. You see a much greater interest in civil rights for minorities. You see a much greater emphasis on sexual liberation, on environmentalism, and all kinds of other things. But the thing is, in societies where people are scrambling to get food, they don't really pay nearly as much attention to that kind of stuff. The United States was in a unique position after World War II because it was with unprecedented wealth, unprecedented levels of technology and economic growth, and all of the economic competitors to the United States had been eliminated in World War II. It was kind of like the mafia. If you manage to eliminate all the other crime families, you're left holding all the goods, and that's kind of the position that the United States was in the post-war period. And that creates this kind of affluent culture that has time to worry about all kinds of things. Like, you start to see during that time period, you start to see therapeutic culture really expand, where I remember in the 70s there was this big wave of pop psychology books about things like how to get in touch with your inner child, and all this kind of stuff. It's stuff that people in poor countries where everything's a struggle to get food, something that people in cultures like that would never give a second thought to. And I think that creates this kind of atmosphere that we see today, where you see this kind of progressive culture that is really about, in some ways, I think progressivism in its present form is kind of like trying to create a world that's just going to be a pink and blue padded baby nursery. I know even when I was growing up, that was the time period in which women were really starting to become integrated into the workforce outside the home. So you had an increasingly greater number of families where both parents were employed. That was just starting when I was a kid. And you had what they used to call latchkey children, which was the idea that, a kid gets off the school bus at the end of the day, he or she doesn't have any parents at home waiting for him or her because the parents are at work, so the kid has a latchkey they carry around their neck. It's like a necklace, only it's the key to their house, so they can let themselves in the house. And I knew kids like that for real who really were latchkey kids growing up. Nowadays, though, they would say a child like that is being abused. They'd probably call the CPS on the parents if the parents weren't there waiting for the kid at the or whatever. In fact, I saw an article a while back about a case where a mom was something like 7 minutes late to pick up a kid from daycare, and they called CPS on the parents for child neglect or something, for leaving their kid in daycare 7 minutes too long or something like that. And during the period between, say, when I was growing up to now, there was a switch towards this kind of culture that's very, very big on, everything has to involve perfect safety, perfect security. Any level of risk, any level of danger is too much. And I think that explains a lot of the issues we see among a lot of younger people today. Increasingly, I'm coming across more and more younger people who just don't seem to have any means of coping with life. If anything that goes wrong in their life is some kind of tragedy. If anybody does anything to offend them, then it's a grotesque personal affront. They're not able to engage with people who disagree with them in some serious way. And it's not just these social justice warrior types and all that. I mean, you find that in the leftist subculture, but I find this all over the place. I find it all over the place, where you have more and more people that I think just seem to have very low life skills, life management skills. And I think it's rooted in the fact that a lot of these people are psychologically disabled, in the sense that they've grown up in this kind of culture where, on one hand, helicopter parenting is the norm. So they're never allowed to fall down and bruise themselves. And then they've spent their life in an environment where nobody ever disagrees with them or challenges them in any way. So it's some kind of personal tragedy if you find that not everybody shares the same idea as you do, and things like that. So I think this whole progressive narrative that I think we've just been describing feeds into that.
Yeah, definitely. Terminal philosophy.
Right. I think another reason why progressivism is a powerful social and cultural force is because of art as well. I think many artists describe themselves as progressive, and artists are, broadly seen as interesting and cool or smart, and many progressives are smart and interesting. But I suppose what I'm saying here is that there's sort of this interesting overlap between progressive thinking and art or music, things like that. And this is more or less in support of the view that if you're not progressive, or if you're at odds with certain progressive ideas or thinking, then you're potentially you're a backwards Christian, stuck up, fuddy-duddy type of a caricature. And that's kind of what not all of them, but that's kind of what many progressives try and superimpose onto non-progressives. Keith had an interesting point earlier, which I think is really important, as it kind of sets up the entire backdrop of the existence of progressivism in the first place. And I was sort of touching on it, but he kind of got to the heart of it, which is that, I mean, really, when you look at different third world societies and different just poorer nations, I mean, when you look across those societies, there's not really interesting philosophies being developed, and there's no therapy, intensive therapy cultures or things like that. I mean, people are just trying to, and veganism too is another thing. Like, there's not much veganism in poorer nations, because they just simply don't have the material wealth or availability to do otherwise. They're just trying to get by. I mean, agrarian societies, yes, while they are simple, I mean, they're at least commensurate with most of human history, I would say, in the sense that it is just more, it's more based upon what people need materialistically and minimally, and not what they need for, entertainment and extravagance and so on and so forth. I think I just think that's one of the most important points. But nowadays it is quite interesting to see that I mean, not every single feminist that I've met, but many of them have a lot of, and this isn't just me like dunking on feminists, but it is interesting to observe that many of them are quite they invest a lot of energy and quite a bit of their own identity into perceived mental issues that they might have. And, if you look on Twitter profiles of self-described feminists, there's typically a list of many of the mental issues that they suffer through, or that may not even have been professionally diagnosed. They're just they're proud to be suicidal or manic depressive or bipolar or what have you. And that I think that they believe that that's something that should be able to discuss out in the open. But I think it goes a bit beyond that. It's almost as if they're trying to make it like it's okay to be, mentally not broken, but just mentally troubled, because I think they have this image in their mind of 1950s suburban dads who are deeply pathological, but they always just have a smile on their face and they just bottle everything up and pretend everything's fine. And I think that's probably true for some people back then, but the therapy culture of North America is pretty bizarre to me, just in the sense that on the one hand, people are being perhaps more open to the general public about their own issues than they should be, and two, they're trying to make this sort of I don't know, trying to get some coolness, some cool factor out of doing that in general. Like it makes you brave to just be out like front and center about every problem that you have. But yeah, again, you don't see that in third world societies whatsoever. And I will say just lastly too that I think again, the pharmaceutical industry, of course, will respond to that because opioid addictions are as bad as they have ever been in general. I think they're decreasing in some cities, but if you're ever in British Columbia, Canada, there is in Vancouver, there's a place called Hastings Street, and Hastings Street is basically what you could describe as ground zero for Canada's homeless drug problem. And it is just kind of like a scene out of a movie. I mean, it looks like the set from Escape to New York. It just, the Hastings Street just looks horribly dilapidated, and there's rats everywhere, and people are shooting up on the street. And then you have ambulances flying up and down the street everywhere trying to address overdoses. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that, this like therapy and drug culture and things like veganism and fruitarianism and all these like secondary, tertiary, niche sort of things, those just aren't available in third world societies, and they're focused on just daily, weekly, monthly survival. And I will just say one thing about Hollywood, then I'll turn it over to Swithun, is that Hollywood has had this enormous impact throughout the 20th century, especially beginning with, after the silent film era in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. There was like a great, film noirs were incredible, and we had the whole golden age of film. But now I think even among progressives and a lot of people on the left, Hollywood is in quite the qualitative decline. And, LA used to be the place of where artists would go seek their fortune and make a career or a name for themselves. Well, if you haven't noticed, a lot of the films that have been released for the last 15 years, a lot of them are just remakes, and a lot of them that are original are in general not that good. And so I guess to wrap my point up here is that Hollywood no longer has its classical, it no longer has this cachet of being this cultural capital. It's just running off of the inertia of its past reputation. And so with Hollywood on the decline, we'll see how we'll see how that affects how progressivism is sort of, I don't know, pushed further into society. I guess I'll just leave it at that.
All right, so we're about at the end of the hour, so we'll begin closing statements. Swithun.
Just to riff off what's just been said, I do think certainly in the 20th century and the 19th, the artists have been pretty influential. The question arises, why do they tend towards a more of a progressive? Although I suppose this is, you could say, broader than progressivism, sort of socialist or leftist bent. And then the question is, does the arts attract people who can mold reality to what they want it to be like rather than what it is like? Because in a sense, writing your own story has even less resistance than having a great technology to change reality. Fossil fuel technologies, electricity, so you can produce, a house or whatever materiality that's nicer than the sort of natural inverted commas reality. So I think that's possible. Although again, I think they get sort of patronage. I think a lot of the art produced, well, I'm assuming Middle Ages is sort of funded by an elite class, and as long as they had the sort of certain ideas, and those are the ones who would be, those would be the ones that were produced. And where you get more mass society, it's more, well, in principle, what the people want. Although then, of course, you get, the things like the Fort Foundation are the ones funding this sort of stuff. So that's, I think, interesting. I do tend to think that all artists will have a quote unquote leftist bent to some extent. On the fact we've got kind of like more leisure time now, I think that's true to some extent. Certainly more leisure time now to sort of navel gaze and look at the woes of society than you had, say, in the industrial period. But my understanding, at least in the pre-industrial period, there was a decent amount of time, which was basically spare time, because you couldn't do anything. I mean, the harvest was the harvest, and you can only harvest at the same time. You could only put it out. You sow at certain times. So whilst at harvest you'd be very busy, other times you wouldn't, and you don't get the same sort of navel gazy stuff that you get today. So I think it's a mixture of sort of spare time and affluence rather than just spare time per se. But to round the whole thoughts off, I think largely we've got to go to a technological explanation. That said, of course, this isn't necessarily technological determinism, because you could potentially use technology to promulgate different ideas about the fixity of reality and more quote unquote rightist ideas. So I would still hold sort of ideas sort of drive everything ultimately. But technology certainly allows them to be disseminated in a much easier and quicker manner than they have sort of historically.
All right, Keith Preston, final thoughts.
What I'm curious about is where all of this is going to go in the future. One thing that I'm interested in is trends research and forecasting and all of that kind of stuff. And it seems to me that on one hand, we're moving towards societies in developed countries where, if anything, the standard of living for the working to middle classes is declining. Joel Kotkin has written about this a bit. He calls it the new feudalism. Now, that's a bit of a reach to call it feudalism. It's an exaggeration, but he talks about how we're developing these societies where we have the kind of stratification in terms of wealth distribution that you find in pre-modern and third world countries on one hand, and then we see the rise of these tech oligarchs and these highly technologized, or however you want to describe it, societies at the same time. And then you also see the rise of this professional class that functions in the same way as the clergy. Like nowadays, instead of having traditional clergy that are preaching against, too much risque movies or something like that, now it's the same kind of thing. Only they want to edit scenes out of old movies because the scene was racist or something like that, or they want to. I know the Home Alone movie from the '80s. They want to. I think they edited out the scene where Donald Trump is in it or something like that. So it's really the same kind of thing, only it takes a different form and a somewhat different value system. So I'm curious as to what the future of progressivism is going to be. For example, in 20 years, are they going to be editing out scenes from movies where someone was eating meat or something like that, or someone was smoking, or it's although it's also possible that if material conditions continue to become worse, that you'll start to see a greater shift towards material politics, politics towards oriented towards meeting material needs. I've seen certainly an increase of politics of that type and it emerging as well. So we'll see where it goes.
All right. Last word to you, terminal philosophy.
All right. Well, I'll just this is similar to what Keith just said, but I'll just reiterate that I will be interested to see the direction of Hollywood, and then if the demand for better art and better cinema will ever come about. Todd, you had a great stream with Right Ruminations and Master Sanders and Logos, I believe, about the declining state of Star Wars, and I think that could be applied to quite a few other film franchises, because I think film is quite powerful in the way that it shapes the way people see the world and other people. So if something isn't done within the next decade or so, I mean, Hollywood is just going to be far less influential or relevant. So I guess we'll see what happens.
Well, again, thanks again, everybody. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis, the Prison Fly Podcast, signing off.